Matt Bromiley, who's actually the lead solutions engineer at LimaCharlie. He's also a regular at presenting at several conferences, a teacher at BlackHat, and a science instructor. So give it up for Matt.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Good morning. Someone's got some audio or something going on. Whatever that is, I hope it's a good game that you're watching. All right, awesome. Well, welcome. Good morning. Good morning. Apologies, it took us a moment to get started. We had, I won't say a technical issue because it's a technical conference, but we had an AV issue, which is something that we may not deal with normally. But welcome. This morning, I'm going to start you off. We're going to talk about knocking out post-exploitation kits. This is something that I've spent a lot of my career dealing with from an incident response perspective. Post-exploitation kits, I got to sit through the rise of post-exploitation kits for a long time to the point where now I feel like we're absolutely flooded with them. So they've been something that I've been interested in for quite a long time. Primarily, we'll talk about some reasons why, but primarily because they lower the barrier of entry for adversaries out there, and they make things a lot easier. But they also make it, I think, a little bit easier for us as well as defenders and incident responders and folks who go about detecting malicious activity and whatnot. So with that said, we're going to get started. I first want to talk about this problem that we have. I'm then going to pick apart a particular exploit kit. I want to make fun of one of them, not because it's anything bad, but because I think it's something worth all of us talking about. We're going to get into some detection capabilities, and then I've got like 2 really quick slides on automated detection for one primary reason. It's automated. If we're sitting here spending a lot of time talking about it, it's not automated. So I should say, here's a Yara SIG, get off to the races, and we're done. That's it, automated. If we're spending half an hour talking about how automated Yara is, we're not doing much. In any event, that'll walk us through what today's going to look like. First and foremost, other thing that I want to bring up is that we have this problem, this ongoing problem. And I believe one of the best ways to be a security analyst, to be a defender, to be an incident responder, to be someone that detects and looks out for and prevents and tries to stop malicious activity is to really understand what that problem is and what that problem looks like. And luckily, this problem is global. The problem that we've got is that there is an absolute proliferation of exploit kits being used out there. Now, I'm picking on Cobalt Strike here just from a keyword search term. You're going to hear me pick on Cobalt Strike a lot during this, but you're going to see how some of the examples that we walk through actually shape up to a lot of the different exploit kits that we'll encounter out there in the wild, or out there in the world, I should say. But the last little screenshot up there is perhaps the most important one. White hat hacker powerhouse in the wrong hands. You can take Cobalt Strike and sub it out for any other term that you want. Mythic C2, Brute Ratel, Sliver, Metasploit, they all fall into the same bucket. Now, I'm going to pause right here. This is not a talk where I'm going to tell you that we should never create and release these things. I am not one of those anti-offensive security tool folks. Does anyone know what I'm talking about when I say offensive security tools and that whole debate that took place on Twitter? Anyone else in here, when they saw a debate about OSTs, think of email? Like, I was stuck in Outlook artifacts for a day or two, and I was like, oh, wait, y'all are not talking about Outlook inboxes. Gotcha. Okay. But it's a problem that we're having. Here's one of the most recent statistics. This is late May from Team Cumry, I believe. This is what they've seen in the month of May out there from an exploit kit perspective. First off, can we just give a round of applause for Metasploit for lasting all of these years and hanging out there? I mean, good job, Metasploit, for just making it this far. I find it interesting that Go Fish made it up on here as well. I would wholeheartedly put Go Fish in the entry vector catalog. I've never seen anyone like exfiltrate full data and kick off a full ransomware campaign using just Go Fish, I should say, but perhaps there's something about it I don't know. But I like seeing, things like Viper C2, Sliver, Mythic, Covenant, Havoc. I feel so bad. Anyone here ever read the Brute Ratel Twitter profile? That guy has so much bravado and so much gusto, and he's got such little statistical representation. I feel so bad for him, but that's okay, because he's got a really great walkthrough and excellent documentation on how to use and detect his tool as well. And then we get some other ones in here. Posh C2 I thought was going to have a little more representation. But long story short, we have a problem. The problem is this graph changes month to month to month. These statistics change month to month to month. And unfortunately, what they continue to tell us is these aren't going away. This problem is not ceasing to exist. Now, Cobalt Strike and Metasploit, I don't really spend a lot of overview time on because we're going to dig into them a little bit deeper. But I brought up some other examples in case you haven't heard of these. Of course, we have to start with some of our open source alternatives that are out there. Sliver is one that's out there. I was actually playing around with this. It's getting a lot of mention in blog posts and testing, like SOC testing and that kind of stuff, probably because it's open source, it's free to download. It's multi-platform, which who does not love a open source C2 framework that works on Windows, Linux, and Mac, just in case you want to compromise your entire environment. But that being said, I do like the fact that they put in parentheses there, possibly every Golang compiler target, but we've not tested them all. That should be the line that scares all of you, because I'll tell you all right now, I've written Golang compiler targets for Solaris and AIX before, and they work very well. Just throwing that out there. In any event, hopefully we don't see that problem. Anyone here still messing around with AIX, by the way? It's okay. You don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to tell us. Covenant's another one that's out there. Covenant actually has a fancy logo. You can tell I'm a little bit sarcastic when it comes to these things, because someone not only sat around and wrote the code for all of these, they also said at some point in time during a very serious meeting, probably fueled by caffeine and all sorts of food, hey man, we need a logo. They were like, dude, I just found the most awesome way to write some .NET C2 implants. It's completely undetectable. Yeah, but we need a logo. What if we took a C and put a sharp in the middle? And then boom, we got a logo. And it's little things like that that I really appreciate. Open source framework, .NET C2. It's got a web-based interface, and I do give them credit for calling themselves the collaborative C2 platform, designed for red teams and offensive security tool emulation, to collaborate on their tests together and things like that, with a beautiful web-based collaboration GUI, which looks like it was my first Bootstrap project. We then get into Mythic C2. Mythic's another one, again, cross-platform. Here we go, same adjectives again and again and again. I feel like I'm at some sort of a InfoSec trade show when I read through these. Cross-platform, post-exploit, red teaming, framework, Golang, Docker. It's funny how the things that we criticize are the same buckets that they fall into. That being said, Mythic's an interesting approach primarily because it's got this really cool like agent-based thing about it. There is no one agent that you customize with config files like you would with Cobalt Strike. Instead, Mythic has these Mythic agents. There's like some massive GitHub repo out there that has all these different versions of agents inside of them. The operating systems that they can be used to target, the languages that they're written in. And I just love the fact that if you look at that C2 channel column, and I wish I could zoom in on it, maybe I can like laser point. Oh, my laser point's not working. It's all right, she's busy. If you look through all these, you'll notice there's a lot of folks that decided to write these amazing. Imagine this, by the way. Imagine you're going to sit down one day and you're going to write a C2. Some sort of beacon or some sort of implant, some sort of software that's going to get deployed out there. It's going to be used to perform all sorts of nefarious activities and do all sorts of things, not illegal, just adversary emulated. That's it. Hey man, what are you going to use for exfiltration in C2? Well, HTTP, of course. It's the only protocol that I know how to use. The number of HTTP represented inside of those C2 channels. Now, before any of you counteract, I know you might be like, well, Matt, it's probably HTTPS as well. You'd be surprised how many times HTTP is the default. You might notice every time I get really sarcastic, by the way, it's an indication that there's a detection capability there. There's a detection possibility. So every time I get sarcastic, it's me pointing holes at the way that they've built these things, at the way that they've decided to construct and put these things together, because they're leaving detection opportunities out there for us. Brute Ratel, whew, this one gets a lot of credit. I saved it to be the last one. It's closed source. It costs $3,000 to get a license. It's got all sorts of crazy features inside, like really hard to read dark mode GUIs and everything like that. Small font so you can squint every time you look at the screen. The website's full of typos all over the place. Definitely not a native English speaker. There's no shade in that, by the way. It's just, unfortunately, if I'm going to spend $3,000 for a post-exploit toolkit when I have all of these free options, you might want to spell exploit correctly, but I'll just leave that out there. The other thing that Brute Ratel is really, really good for is its graphics. Again, someone sat down and said, dude, the graphics. So they even have their own Here's how we map to the MITRE attack matrix from an offensive perspective. This is on the website. Can anyone here read that? Someone sat down and made this and was like, this is a great idea. But that's okay. They left it out there. And I do appreciate this actually because it lets me take this and overlay it on top of like my MITRE attack defense matrix and see where my holes are. That's a really easy way because that's how you do defense, right? You just take two graphs and line them up and then see where my differences are. Nonetheless, my point is not to make too much fun of these. My point is to prove that there are a bunch of different variants out there. There's a bunch of different capabilities out there. Perhaps the thing that we should all be focused on is if I'm an adversary and this one doesn't work, I'll go download that one. And if that one doesn't work, we'll go download this other one and see what happens. And this is where you get that change in TTPs from adversary or intra-adversary TTP changes, is you get this crazy explosion, massive 90-page threat intel report. Adversary has changed their tactics. They went to GitHub and they downloaded some new code. Boom, change in tactics. No, they didn't. They just got caught in one place and decided to use something that they weren't hopefully going to get caught with. But that being said, you do have some threat actors who stick to their guns. And they hold their C2 frameworks very, very closely. And they stick with them. Anyone know why, if I'm a threat actor, if I'm an adversary, I'm going to stick to a C2 framework months, years into the game, especially when there's so many other options out there? Feel free to yell out your answer. Don't wait for the mic. We'll make it fun. TLP clear. Come on, no one's going to know. What's that? Competence? They only know. Imagine you spend 2-3 years writing one programming language and someone comes along and says, hey, you want to learn .NET overnight? Nope, I'm all set. I'm going to stick with what I know. Again, I'm being sarcastic because there's a detection opportunity. If I have an adversary that sticks to their guns and holds true to an adversary or post-exploitation framework, guess what? Now I know what I'm looking for in this case. I'm going to use that to segue into this little section I'm calling hard-coded, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek with intention, primarily because I wanted to ask, like, what makes these exploit kits so attractive to red teamers? If I'm a red teamer, an offensive person, what am I going for here? Well, I like the fact that they're all-in-one packages, they're highly customizable and modular, they've got unique features, again, brute Ratel, crazy graphics, Covenant, C2, and .NET capabilities. You never know when you're going to need all of those things. Mythic's got all those different frameworks out there in case I need to subvert Apple MDM or something like that. Some of them have graphical interfaces, but I'm pretty sure it's the last bullet point that really captures red teams. It's that automated reporting feature. That fact that you can execute an entire pen test and then at the end just be like, and we're done, billable hours. But unfortunately, the exact same list, probably minus the reporting part, is also what makes it attractive to adversaries. One thing that I tend to remind folks a lot of, adversaries are very skilled at entry vectors. And I don't mean necessarily they're good at finding them. I mean they're good at exploiting them. And if you think I'm wrong, you need to go do some homework on what is going through a firestorm right now. Anyone know? A file transfer service called? Thank you. All right, good. Everyone here is up to date. Called MoveIt. MoveIt's going through some crazy, and we're just waiting. I don't mean we, but really we, where everyone's waiting for that first POC to drop on GitHub and what happens when it drops. We have minutes, seconds, or hours before no more conference fun. It's just a matter of time. Adversaries are very good at weaponizing things like that. They're good at finding vulnerabilities. They're good at probing for weaknesses. They are really good at abusing credentials, good at taking advantage of remote access programs and things like that. This is their strong suit for a lot of adversaries out there. This is what they're good at. They're good at building crazy, massive OSINT campaigns about these targets and these organizations they want to go through. I'm going to target this supply chain vector and then go after that piece of code and that supply chain and this and that, and boom, now I'm in SolarWinds. We're good to go. I'm going to fish here. That's going to lead up to that. I'm going to fish over to that person. I'm going to hit that department. Boom, BEC. They're really good at those initial vectors. Guess what they're not good at? Writing reflective memory loaders in order to execute code without being detected by modern EDR software. See how quickly I went from write a fish to write some code? A lot of adversaries exist in that first bucket. They're good at entry vectors. They're good at getting in. This, by the way, is why you see marketplaces set up the way they are. Marketplaces a lot of times sell access. Because guess what? I might have a really successful phishing campaign, and I might have really, really good loaders just sitting and waiting in a bunch of different organizations. But I don't have the scale or the skill or, quite frankly, the care to exploit those any further. That's what they're good at. I would go a step further, and I would say the other thing, and for anyone not familiar, this is our typical adversary life cycle. For anyone who's not familiar with this, the different stages where I've drawn little boom marks are where these kits tend to thrive. Notice this is not your initial compromise, your entry vector. This is further on down the line. There are a lot of adversaries out there. Not all of them know Windows as well as they should. They barely know Linux. They probably don't know Mac at all. Exploit kits make it really easy for them to have a presence, have a foothold, move laterally, perform that recon, and do all those things and look elite. All because they went to GitHub and downloaded some code. However, interestingly enough, despite all of these different options and how customizable these things can get, C2 kits actually have finite options and capabilities about them. This creates really good space for detection capabilities. We're going to pick on Cobalt Strike for a little bit here. First off, the stage block in Cobalt Strike's malleable profile, which makes it look like anything we want it to look like, controls how it's written into memory and how that content is loaded. Oh, there we go. By default, by the way, if anyone notices my reference URL at the bottom, this is Cobalt Strike's help guide. This is not like Matt's adventure into reverse engineering. By default, Beacon allocates memory via virtual alloc. It can be changed to one of two options, heap alloc or map view of file. Despite highly customizable features, and this is the question I really wanted to get to, despite that table off to the side, all these different features, all these things that can be done, how many adversaries do you think actually make changes or ever upgrade their software? Let's be clear, by the way, if you're using Cobalt Strike illegally, you're downloading a cracked version. You are not getting up-to-the-minute support. So you're not taking advantage of all that cool new stuff on YouTube. You are left and stuck with that old version. They're not changing any of these. Larger features, something that escapes a certain disk or a certain kilobyte size, gets pushed down as a DLL, subsequently gets loaded via a temporary process, injected into the process. But guess what? This is my favorite part about all of this. Does anyone know what process is typically used for injection? The default injection process, the one that gets abused the most up on stage. Anyone know? Go ahead. Oh my gosh, this poor process, rundll32.exe, is the most abused process that is out there. If those ones and zeros had feelings, they would tell us so many things. Rundll32, you say? Interesting. Guess who else likes to sit on top of and use and abuse rundll32? Here's some more Mythic documentation. Here's some brute Ratel documentation. So what I like to do in post-exploit kits is find these common points, these common grounds. Because again, there's only a finite number of ways to do things. Believe it or not, I know it feels like we keep uncovering more and more. There is a set number of ways to load malicious code in Windows, Linux, or Mac. I don't know what that number is. None of us here do. We're probably hopefully getting closer to that, and then a new version drops out. But my point is this, there's only a certain number of ways to do that. I like how they try to take advantage of that. Let's take a look at lateral movement. Run DLL. This is again picking on Cobalt Strike. Cobalt Strike will establish a series of named pipes. Guess what? Lateral movement is another area of excellent detection capabilities. Cobalt Strike has a finite number of named pipes it will use, except for that last one at the bottom. It starts with a star, like there's random characters in there. But everything else is hard-coded. Again, hard-coded name pipe names that we know about. By the way, MS Agent is one of the most popular ones out there, seen in a lot of, I'm going to call them open source investigations. What that means is anonymized investigations that have been blogged about. There are placeholders, and I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but I just want to prove a point. There are hard-coded features in all of these C2 frameworks. There are hashes that depend on the API function and the DLL being used for C2 capabilities. They are predictable, they're known, they're documented, they're referenced. What we see most observed from a lot of threat actors who utilize exploit kits is some sort of novel entry vector followed by a typical adversary lifecycle. So I'm going to use those steps from a detection perspective. By the way, if you're taking pictures, I will have these slides available for you as well, just so you know. I think they get made available, right? TLP clear, I think? I hope so. If not, these will be made available because of that right there. So network traffic is the first place I like to start from a detection perspective. This is often the area with least visibility. Now, before we get started, I know some of you live in countries where network traffic visibility is not as liberal as it is in maybe where I'm from, which is just like a couple hours down south. However, I will argue it is the easiest place to detect a lot of those different stages. Anyone see the malware? Haha, plot twist, the entire thing is malware. In this case, I just zoomed in on a couple of different details from a network perspective. Understanding what this looks like, there are still parts inside of network traffic that are going to correlate to how these beacons, how these C2s are set up. Whether it's HTTP or HTTPS, anything that transpires across a network is going to leave an artifact for me to find. IR reports show time and time again that these C2 frameworks, regardless of which one it is, will start with that initial entry vector. They'll start with that loader. That loader will, in often unencrypted space, download DLL modules, some other code, whatever else it needs, and then subsequently move to C2. Guess what? That gives us a chance for detection. I'm not kidding when I say some of the more recent intrusions that I've worked or seen or observed or read about start in plain text traffic before they move to encryption. Folks, if we're starting in plain text traffic, then we need to be at that point from a detection perspective as well. By the way, I've said this publicly before, but if you're like detecting on the ransom note, you're a little late in the process. Anyways, these are not publicly available, but these are plain text details, plain text IOCs that I can use to my advantage. And then someone's going to come back and say, well, Matt, what about encrypted traffic? And hopefully everyone knows the answer to encrypted traffic. If it's encrypted, we can't see it, right? Doesn't mean we can't profile it. I'm a huge fan of every single tidbit of metadata I can get out of any single piece of evidence you're going to give me. So if you give me traffic and it's not encrypted, I'm going to tear it apart. If you give me traffic and it is encrypted, I'm going to tear it apart and I'm going to profile it and I'm going to do everything I can to understand what that traffic's doing and where it's going. In my opinion, encrypted channels leave very, very telltale signs inside of them, such as JA3, JA3S signatures, different certificate, hashes, details, all sorts of really, really yummy things. I don't know why this slide is in here twice. I apologize. That's okay. There we go. That's what I wanted. I wanted that right there. I wanted the certificate details, which show up. Probably had a copy-paste error. In the last few minutes, we'll also talk about host detection as well. Again, C2 exploit kits require a host to initiate connectivity. This is not some sort of amoebus blob that's just floating around the internet. It's not the Cobalt Strike, the brute Ratel. It's just an install. It's a binary. It's a set of ones and zeros. Activity on a host means artifacts on a host as well. We talked about some things a little bit earlier about some capabilities. I kind of skimmed over them as different features that can be enabled or disabled. Usage of PowerShell is one that I'll pick on, primarily because it is just oh so prevalent in a lot of intrusions and a lot of things that are out there. I hate to say it, but PowerShell continues to be this wonderful, bittersweet language that allows me to automate all sorts of things, but allows them to automate all sorts of things as well. But, of course, PowerShell logs are an excellent opportunity for detection using some of the keywords and some of the hard-coded values that we've talked about earlier. Can anyone read that? I can't either. I thought we'd have a bigger screen, but that's okay. Again, slides will be made publicly available for you. Oh, look, I'll zoom in for you. There we go. Perfect. So I'm going to start to rip apart things like this. And you may be up here like, Matt, really in June 2023, we're talking about PowerShell detection, and I'm sitting back here saying, guess what? It's what the adversaries are using. It's where they're at. It's one of the most common things inside of their tool bag, probably because, anyone know why an adversary will continue to use a tool even after we've known about it for years? Because it works. It still works. I've got a bunch of different keywords that I can hit through in case you're sitting inside of some massive SIM instance or some Splunk and you need to say, Matt, I've got terabytes of PowerShell logs. What am I looking for? By the way, does anyone know how many different aliases there are for things inside of PowerShell? It's to the tune of thousands that are out there. But luckily, some folks over at Unit 42 did some analysis for us recently, not us, but like all of us, and found out, hey, there's actually some pretty commonly used ones that are out there. While we're on the topic of host detection, I'm also going to push you towards process execution. Because what process do I know gets abused the most? They listen. See? It worked out. I'm going to either look for my native EDR telemetry. By the way, that's what we do at LimaCharlie. That's all I'm going to mention about it. Windows event logs. I'm also going to maybe gravitate towards the super hyper vigilant, really, really visible log known as Sysmon and get this thing out there. I might also look at some of my system event logs to look for things like what? A service that was started pointing at the admin chair of 127001. Yep. By the way, free threat hunting tip. Go ahead and do your threat hunting analysis through all your event logs. And if you have any of these, you have a problem. or you have a remote thing that's running that's providing someone access to a thing. Sysmon event 1 is going to point me towards much more specific details. It's going to let me use some of those keyword searches that I'm going to pick out of those different exploit kits. In this example, we're picking on Cobalt Strike only because it's the example we walked through earlier, but my point remains the same. Oh, they're done. Do I need to hurry up? Almost there. They're done. They're done early. My point remains the same. There are hard-coded values inside of all of these C2s in the way that they're configured. Because one of the things that not a lot of folks forget or remember, therefore they forget them, is that these are C2 frameworks created by humans. Humans have tendencies. We have habits. We have things that we rely on. We have late-night coding binges where we just have to get something out the door. And we have amazing coding revelations where we've written something no one's ever seen before, of course, until it gets stolen and then used again. So in my final minute, I'll remind you that there are a lot of ways to detect these things automatically. And watch, this is going to be really fast because this is how fast automated detection should be. The more I know about a toolkit, the more it is easier for me to look for. The more it is easy, the easier it is for me to find things that are out there. But if I take a look at some of the open source automated detections that are out there, guess what they're looking for? Execution of run DLL 32. All brings us back to home. Sigma, Yara, all using the same signatures, the same details, the things that we saw before, looking for the exact same options. So understanding a C2 framework helps me then understand how to detect it, helps me then read the rules that are written for it, and then use those rules to find that activity. And I think we are right at time for questions. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Matt, yes, perfect. Thank you for this presentation. Are there any questions? Who's going to ask the first question?
I could have kept
that was my
talking.
question.
I could have kept going. We wanted to leave a couple of minutes for questions. I'm going to use this time.
Yeah, no, otherwise it's yours,
unless a question comes up. I'm going to use this time to cover the automated detections a little bit. So the two examples that I brought up here were Sigma in the first slide and then Yara in the second one. Just a quick note, in case you're unfamiliar with how these work, and by the way, I hope we're getting to the point where like Sigma, the use of Sigma and the use of Yara is becoming fairly widespread and fairly wide scale. Hopefully it is. Like coffee table conversation. What I mean by that is I'm hoping that you're sitting around with folks at this conference like, oh yeah, I just wrote a Sigma rule and it worked. And everyone's like, cool, yep, totally understand what that means, right? But in case we don't, in case someone needs to be familiar with that, Sigma is a really, really solid open source rule-based, or sorry, I'm going to call it an open source repository of rules that can be really applied across any general set of data that's out there. I love the fact that it's very versatile. I love the fact that it's kept up to date. And I love the fact that the moment a threat report is released, there is someone somewhere, often in Europe, writing a Sigma detection rule for a thing that was just pushed out there. But what I want to draw your attention to in this key point here is after understanding and going through all the different details of frameworks that we did, guess what they're looking for? They're looking for simple abuse of processes like run DLL 32. Now you could take the Cobalt Strike out of this particular rule if you want and drop in any of these other frameworks. You can drop in Brute Ratel, you can drop in Sliver, you can drop in Mythic, whatever it is. Doesn't matter. The point being, they all at the end of the day fall into the same funnel. There's a very wide mouth of that funnel because there are dozens of exploit kits out there. They all follow down to the same ways to load code into memory. The same processes get abused to do that thing. And then once you get into the stages of lateral movement, guess what? They all utilize the same one or two protocols to move around. So when I say there are finite options in the way that you can do a thing from an exploit kit framework, we're actually talking about computing architecture and the way that it can be abused. There's only so many ways to move laterally in a Windows environment. There's only so many ways to move laterally inside of a Linux environment, but adversaries are not going to discover something new. And furthermore, they're not in the business of rewriting protocols or writing protocols to get to a certain place. They find ways to abuse something, and if they can't, then they just find ways to stay hidden. And that's really it. So what we're looking for is ways that they stay hidden, and we're going to subvert and expose those different techniques that are out there. The other one that I pulled up as an example was a Yara signature. The reason for pulling this up is to find those pieces of malware either on disk or in memory as well. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is this is actually a Yara rule written for those for those hash combos we talked a little bit about earlier. Depending on the different DLL and API calls that you would use in something like Cobalt Strike, we know the hashes well enough that we can also pinpoint their signatures in an executable or in memory. So again, understanding the exploit kits helps us defend against them, helps us understand how they work, helps us find commonalities, and then helps us write detections. And now I think we're actually at time. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt.